Well, 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 Lazarus members, very happy to be joining a remarkable friend of mine, a remarkable mind and heart, JaneEvershed, who's no stranger to the Lazarus archive. Now, curious thing here, Jane and I both began well over a year ago doing a sort of parallel dive into, actually about a year and a half ago, into corrected history, into all of that stuff, which is fast becoming one of the more important areas of focus as it relates to truth and disclosure, revelation, and the tribulation that we're going through as a planet and as a species. As I've gone to great pains to explain to my audience for the last few years, really correcting the historical narrative becomes seminal to the activation of consciousness at the individuated level, much less the morphogenetic level, which of course is what we're aiming toward. We're talking about being able to awaken fully from this dream spell and activate the mechanics of ascension, and resurrect ourselves individually and collectively. The telling of the story becomes very, very important. So one of the most axiomatic points in the informed history is, of course, the Renaissance, also to some extent referred to as the Enlightenment. And that's the piece that Jane has been focusing on lately. And I believe, and she believes, that there's some real breakthrough revelation here in her focus. So in the first instance, before I wheeze on into the dictionary definition of Renaissance, Jane, great to see you, darling girl. Welcome.
It's wonderful to be here, Sacha.
So let me just look at the dictionary definition. Renaissance, otherwise known as the rebirth period in European civilization immediately following the Middle Ages, and conventionally held to have been characterized by a surge of interest in classical scholarship and values. The Renaissance also witnessed the discovery and exploration of new continents, the substitution of the Copernican for the Ptolemaic system of astronomy, and the decline of the feudal system, i.e., a move toward centralization away from agrarian rural communities back to the citadel, to the Babylonian cityscape. All roads lead to Rome, all of that stuff. So the decline of the feudal system becomes an integral component, and the growth of commerce, okay, really important. Mercantile, Phoenician, commerce, exchange, collateralization, securitization, monetization, okay, of living systems, really important, the mercantile element. So the growth of commerce and the invention or application of such potentially powerful innovations as paper, printing, the mariner's compass, and gunpowder, okay, the genesis of war proper. And to the scholars and thinkers of the day, however, it was primarily a time of the revival of classical learning and wisdom after a long period of cultural decline and stagnation. So that's a brief summation of what we popularly understand by the Renaissance. So I'm going to give the floor and the talking stick to Juanita Bonita. Jane here is going to share her screen with us and walk us through a sequence of slides which she's prepared. And I will interject and intervene where I deem it necessary. Hopefully I'll be able to put my feet up and snooze for the next hour. When I say snooze, of course, I'll be wrapped with interest. But darling, by all means, share your screen. Let's go. Dive straight into it. The Renaissance as it relates to corrected history.
I was laughing when you were reading that, because I myself never actually read the definition of the Renaissance when I did this. And
Right.
As you were reading off, I was looking at everything you were saying and just laughing, because it couldn't be further from the truth, honestly. because with this lifting of the veil and the earth being bombarded with these higher resonant energies, we can see so much more clearly now, and it's just all being revealed. And this is so important right now. And I'm asking humanity to revisit creation as our true instrument for positive evolution. We've been giving our creation currency away, and we need to reclaim it for our own agenda. So you will see how the Renaissance completely co-opted our creativity for their agenda. The Renaissance was not the glorious rebirth that you were led to believe it was. It was more likely the rebirth of Lucifer after Nero, the Antichrist, emerged at the end of the so-called fall of Rome. And there's so many things I could say about the Renaissance at this point, but what I mostly want to say is that this work that you see up here was definitely a message from our ancestors from that feudal time that you spoke of in that description. What that really was the end of Tartaria and the Roman Catholic Church coming in and disrupting them, and they called it a feudal system.
Understood. Okay, so move to, yeah, thank you. Now you've moved that, I can see it. Archangel Michael slaying the devil, because that was obscured until a minute ago. Great. So this is really interesting. So you're suggesting the Renaissance was a catalyzing point for the emergence of latter-day Luciferianism.
Absolutely. And from my research, I found that it was so much more than that. It was like a psychological predator nesting operational reset. And the first age of official censorship too. And it set our evolution back about a few hundred years.
Fascinating.
So we'll go to the next one.
Yeah.
And from my research, I can see that we actually came from a truly divine lineage, which was wiped out and existed in a state of harmony with heaven and earth. And this is about 500 years before the Renaissance period started. And this is when the Crusades had begun their pillaging of these peaceful lands, which were referred to in your introduction as the age of discovery. And so I believe these people were the true bloodline peoples that embodied the Christ consciousness, and they were destroyed by that whole myriad of premeditated and ruthless actions taken before the Renaissance, but instituted in a formal manner during the Renaissance in order to reset the world.
Okay.
So, they were running around killing Christians for centuries, and it was too financially draining for them. So in the end, they decided to embrace it. There was the Diocletianic persecutions very, very early on, but they were the last and most severe persecutions of Christians. So obviously the popes and the Roman Catholic Church just donned the mantle of false Christianity, much like the Khazarian mafia stole the Jewish signature.
Yes.
And so it's our lineage now that we are fighting our lives against these demonic forces, which are trying to take over the entire planet. To the point where we may never have recovered if we hadn't had help. And we'll go into that a bit further on. And so you can see by these images, there's the wealthy church with all their poor little people following behind. It's no different today than it was then.
Oh, right. So you've got your sort of ermine-clad nobility at the front end, and behind them the scavenging peasantry.
Right, exactly. I couldn't put it better.
Generic classical 5. What's the versus soulful, authentic? Generic classical versus the soulful and the authentic. Interesting. Da Vinci versus El Greco in that sense.
Would you like me to explain?
Please.
So if you look at El Greco's work, you can see that he has this dynamism of self in the work. His soul is being expressed in it. It's not perfect. It's not classical. And he ended up being a forerunner of expressionism, as you can see by his later work there.
Yes.
And with the why I call it the generic classical is because I believe they had a methodology of measuring the human anatomy, and they applied it. And this is how they were able to interchange artists so easily, because it was generic. And this is also another reason why we measure great art as the most realistic, because we're looking back at the Renaissance, but yet it wasn't the soulful art we were told it was. I'm going to go into that a little bit on later. You'll see more of why I say that. So this is the interior of the Raphael Rooms in the Vatican Museum. So I'm going to make this statement just to pique your interest, and then I'll explain it later, how the Pope either commissioned this piece by Raphael to show how terrible the fall of Rome was compared to the people and life under the current Pope, or the fresco was already there from the real point in time when it was painted, because it has been proven that Rome fell 1,000 years later than history tells us. Or, here's the most interesting one, you can choose which one you want. Raphael was using camera obscura to paint.
Chiaroscuro, yeah, which is
So chiaroscuro is light and dark, but camera obscura was when they used a lens to, the light came through and it inverted the image on the wall.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So now, because I went down this rabbit hole by myself, and I was thinking they were using camera obscura, so when I was hunting around, I found that none other than David Hockney had actually come to the same realization. And he did it with models, and he showed how it was done. So there's a very good likelihood that they could have used this camera obscura to get all those perfect proportions, because from the Byzantine period, you know what, that work is very flat and out of proportion, and there's no perspective. And then it just jumps to this realism. And then it goes on to mannerism, which seems to pick off where the Byzantine left when you look at art in history.
Yeah.
So this is what they were doing. And David Hockney built up this whole case around it, even wrote a book on it. And so we know now also that these great Roman and Greek artists of antiquity, which it wasn't antiquity, was said to be the inspiration for much of the Renaissance art that was produced. But I think it was created most probably by the divine bloodline that preceded them, whether those be Christians, Tartarians, we don't know, because it's so hard to find information because there's nothing there. So, you know, we sit here risking ourselves as fools for not being these scholars, because there is no information to find. We have to deduce it ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, and so another thing that happened was apparently these great ancient Greek sculptors and Roman sculptors didn't have their names attached to their work, which is a very interesting fact, because then that made it so much easier for the Renaissance artists to actually claim them. But I'm going to give you really good examples as we go forward. This is just sort of an explanation, you know what I mean? And you can see here that this doesn't look like the same hand that made these three. They're all so very different, yet they are all claimed to be Michelangelo, and I'm going to go into that a little bit deeper. For instance, that marble slab for the David had been quarried and then abandoned for over 40 years before Michelangelo claimed it. Then they said he worked on it for more than 14 years until he died at the age of 88. And then he was also said to be working on the basilica and this tomb at the same time as well at the age of 88. They all have these incredible abilities to create, but yet you'll go to another description of what he did and you'll find out he created the David when he was 26 years old.
Exactly.
So It's very different. But one thing I found that really stood out to me, Sacha, was that he's actually on record as self-proclaiming that he was neither an architect or a painter. And not only that, he also wrote and published not one, but 2 full-length autobiographies in his own lifetime.
Fascinating.
Writing his own biography in stone, I guess you could say.
Let's go. Crusades were specific expeditions to seize strategic and culturally significant land, both Jewish and Muslim, under the guise of being a holy war. I think that's a fascinating insight. The Crusades were a premeditated series of religious wars initiated, supported, and directed by the Roman Catholic Church beginning in 1095. And I notice that is nigh 30 years after the Doomsday, 1066, right? Because 1066 is a seminal node point that then catalyzed what you're describing here, because 1066 was the onset of, or the genesis point of indexing human beings, of codifying living systems into spells and bombs, church bans, names, registrations, all of that. When the scribes and the onset of technocrats, bureaucrats, the great scourge of humanity began in 1066 with Doomsday. So I think that that's very interesting connection or parallel to what you're describing here, but crack on, the Crusades, indeed.
Well, yeah, they initiated in 1095 and the first wave ended in 1291. So that's 200 years of that. And then they ended in the 1400s. So that's almost 400 years of crusading around the world and chopping people up, etc., etc.
Right, doing what? Sacrifice of innocence at the same time, rolling out the franchise of blood cultism, and the genesis of economics, flipping living souls into money, the rollout of the mercantile and Phoenician dragnet, right?
Absolutely. And in 1095, those were just the little first baby steps of the death cult parasite, we've arrived at today. But then along comes flamenco, and him and Putin, really, they dealt us a royal flush, exclusively from Russia. The combination of the Tartarian maps released in 2013, and then flamenco going through, checking on an astrological level at what was going on with the stars and the events on Earth.
Right, as if we could ever make a separation between the two. So what a fascinating triangulation. And curious, Mother Russia coming to the rescue of humanity yet again.
And right now digging out the Khazarian mafia from Ukraine.
Yeah, exposing them with all of their biolabs and
the very root of all that evil. So, but the combination of the maps and flamenco's revised history will forever change humanity's perspective on history as we knew it. So this is huge, because all the scholars of all the days past are basing all their theses on a false history.
Yeah.
And also I want to say at this point too that his credentials are stellar. He worked with the United States in the 70s, trying to figure out how to get to the moon. And that's when he started realizing the stars weren't aligning with everything.
When in the 70s, did you say?
73, I think it was.
Fascinating.
So he's calculating a high correlation and concluding that the ancient history of Rome is a copy of the medieval history of Rome, which clashes
Right.
with obviously with mainstream accounts.
Right.
Of course, he's absolutely not recognized by the scientific community.
Yeah.
And I think it's time for another book burning, but this time it'll be on our side. You see how he would look back at the Middle Ages and see how it was a reflection of the timeline that came before it. And then these fictitious characters were placed on that timeline. So which man really lived? King Uzziah or the Byzantine Emperor Theodosius II? Because it was just a made-up story. And then the historians that wrote all the lies claim that Rome was established in 753 BC and fell in 1453 AD. And it was said to include large territorial holdings around the Mediterranean Sea in Europe, North Africa, Western Asia. But most of that same area that Rome claimed as its own territory was actually a part of Tartaria. And that's when we find that out in the old maps that Putin released. And then what that set off a huge domino effect all over the world. Everybody was looking at Tartaria and the maps. And this is 10 years ago, so we've really discovered a lot since then.
That's right.
And this is what is confirming that the Renaissance was the start of a reset after the decimation of the Tartarian peoples. And that the evidence for this has just spread throughout the world with the advanced architecture and art and technology that's been covered up. And we've been living in a dark age actually since the Renaissance. And I was poking around looking at sculptures and things, and in the background, way in the corner, it was in the Vaticano Museo, and there I saw that griffin. And it has been said that the Tartarians were in Rome, and it's proof that they were there, and it's proof that the architecture was built by them as well.
So basically, classical Rome and the Vatican and all of that stuff, we're essentially looking at ancient Tartaria.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
In the same way that we can say the same in trace elements of the architecture in Prague and Vienna and Paris, not so much Paris, subsequent to the great takedown there, but London, all around the world, in point of fact, all around the world.
You're absolutely right on that. And here I found a snapshot where you can actually see the Roman architectural style connected right there's the Tartarian architecture. You see the difference.
Yep.
It's just as plain as day. And then now we're going and looking at the art. And when we study Bruegel, we also see evidence of Tartaria from the Renaissance in the painting that Bruegel did of these little peasant towns, which it's indicating that, you know, there was a purge and that preceded the town folks' existence.
Yeah.
And the importance of this is obvious. We all know about the three big powers, you know, the independent states of the world that rule the world: financial, the military, and the religious.
So Vatican City, City of London, and Washington District of Columbia, which is also a city unto itself. So these are principalities that do not answer to the host nation. They do not answer to anyone other than themselves and their invisible masters.
Absolutely. So on the left, you've got Francis Bacon, and he was the first Viscount of St. Alban and an English professor and scientist. And this man, or I can't even call him a man really, he was a sitting member of the Council for the Virginia Company, involved in transatlantic colonial projects. And this is what he said. He believed that conquest and acquisition of peoples and territories through force, followed by subjugation, conferred a legal right and title. And then in 1801, less than 200 years after Bacon had left his invasive little footprints all over America, that's when the District of Columbia came into being and was ceded from the federal government of the United States. So you can see how early on it was that these three got together and how long we've been sitting under this big power grid of the combination of the Roman Catholic Church, the military power of the United States, and the financial power of the banking system.
And that last observance there with the obelisks taking center stage in the epicenter of each of those principalities within that trifecta, those obelisks, of course, indicative and redolent of allegiance to the cult of Osiris, to the Egyptian cultism.
Absolutely, and all three are from Egypt.
The Black Death plague originated in Kazakhstan in the 1320s, springboarded to 1720. I don't know where that is, the secondary one. 1820, 1920, and then 2020. We knew that there was some key Babylonian mysterium cult significance with Covidiacy, really being 2020 being that critical year. But its migration followed the sea and land trading routes of the medieval world. Curious. So you're saying that the Black Death plague originating in Kazakhstan in the 14th century was at the same time pursuing this kind of mercantile, meandering mercantile complex, like an octopus that slowly started to circumnavigate the globe, and its migration path following the sea and land trading routes of the medieval world franchised not just the Black Plague, Black Death, but in the wake of it, usury, far more serious and devastating and deadly than a mere plague. So it's very interesting how that evil managed to meander its way into the world.
And this is so interesting too, because they really keep great records of their diseases. So you can really track them by these diseases. It's
Right.
really the backstory behind the Renaissance. And it's only super recently that scientists have found the origination of the Black Death plague, which is Kyrgyzstan, which is right next door to where? Kazakhstan, which is the world's financial superpower, or from whence all this financial stuff originated, and they began to spread out and take over the world. And so they were definitely using these diseases to impact or spread. And they say it's spread by human society, but you got to read oligarch into that, in order to affect the global economics and thereby the power structures writ large. And this Black Death was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. And guess what? It spread from Italy to other European countries. So they brought it into Italy, the seat, the Roman Church, and then it went from there out. And it had a huge effect on everything, the socioeconomics, everything. And it also ensured that Marxism, communism, which is the preferred model for the New World Order's dream political scenario, would eventually be realized about now, because China had meanwhile been creeping to the top of the world economy when the C-19 pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And so now China is at the very top, which you'll see in a graphic later. So we're at that point now where all these diseases have come to the point where, you know, we'll own nothing and be happy and merely exist as their surveilled inventory.
Very good. Okay.
But first they had to sell us the Renaissance.
Yep.
And then as far as the Tartarians go, it was 400 years later that they were killed off by famine. So there you have the complete picture of the complete wipeout. I've always wondered about that, you know, how exactly did they do it? A large part of it was about famine, which killed about 2 million people, which was 30% of the Russian people at the time. And they also said it was the result of a volcanic winter. But, you know, who knows what kind of technology they had? Did they create this volcano? You know, we just don't know, because all the disasters have always been blamed on the wrath of God or Mother Earth. But now we know they may have had technology. And this is one of the biggest, single most invasive doctrines that damaged humanity's true evolution during the Renaissance period. And it was when civilized is superior to indigenous and male is superior to female, the great Renaissance silenced more than half the world forever. So women have been allowed to engage fairly recently in world affairs, but sadly only on the condition that their actions serve the established agenda. But if I was to pick one thing that happened during the Renaissance that affected us more than anything, it would be this: the exclusion of indigenous peoples and women from being a part of humanity's evolutionary process. And Aristotle said it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. But I would say it is the mark of an uneducated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it, because the exclusivity of the generically educated mind is bound by the bias that civilized is superior to indigenous and male is superior to female.
Very good.
So we had all these European philosophers pontificating about everything, but there was never any input from the indigenous people. So, you know, when you have half the species aren't there from the dialogue, and they've been removed for hundreds of years, so now they have not even a chance of any philosophical debate on behalf of the entirety of our species, which makes the art of philosophy as it stands today, it makes it moot.
Yeah.
And then these three characters, oh my goodness, I'm sure you know them well, Sacha.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I've maintained for years that it was Ignatius Loyola's departure that fine day from the caravan that he was traveling with, when he stopped the caravan and told his retinue, I want to be alone, leave me alone, wait for me. And he left the road with the caravan and went through the woods into a field on his own, and came back some time later a completely changed being, and had instantaneously, clearly he'd had some epiphany or some demonic intervention, which is my take. I'm desperately curious to know. If I could use a time glass and go back in time, that's the point I would choose. If I could only choose one point in time to go back to observe, I would go back to that day when Ignatius Loyola left the caravan and went into the field on his own. Something happened, because when he returned, he had militarized the message of Christ. He'd weaponized it and set forth his army of Christ. And the perversion that is Jesuiticism, the diabolical, heinous, sacrilegious, satanic evil that is Jesuiticism emerged that fine day. So I'm very, very curious about it. But yes, indeed. So Ignatius Loyola, to me, the pivotal character, founded the Jesuits in 1540. And then Scaliger rewrote history 1583, and Sir Francis Bacon, as you have alluded already, rewrote the Bible in 17th century, and really, in a sense, deviated the critical narrative almost single-handedly at that point. Yeah.
Well, the thing I love about the statue of Ignatius Loyola, it looks like that's the black sun behind him, and he's got that cross, and he's going to hit somebody over the head with it. So they were working together, as you can see, Scaliger, Flamenco's nemesis, writing history, but there were others. There was Trithemius and Ponvinio, and Trithemius had one of his books blacklisted by the censorship bureau of the Pope because it was sharing the black magic and the spells that were available. But now it was published eventually in 1900. And they just made so much stuff up that people believed at the time as well. But it's been disproved. A lot of the stuff in Ponvinio's work was disproved while he was still alive. And Bacon rewrote the Bible at the behest of King James, and he was a 33rd degree Mason. And his version of the Bible was designed for one audience with a hidden coded narrative in the same text for another audience. So the scriptures that he wrote were written on two levels, a basic level for the ordinary readers and a limited knowledge, and the concealed level for the initiated audience with a higher knowledge, like the occult Rosicrucians.
Yes.
So there we have what they were doing, working together in lockstep to take over the whole academia realm. And then obviously this is the other big one, the Unum Sanctum, the impact on humanity's demise, also through the control of commerce and everything else, as you alluded to earlier. But if ever there was a reason to call the Renaissance a reset, it would be Unum Sanctum, which happened in 1300 when the Catholic Church bestowed upon itself the right to ownership of the soul and body of every man, woman, and child on earth. And I think where they got this from was the slavery period just before. I came across a letter that was written by a slave, and it said, "I gave and sold myself of my own free will as a slave to Elias, son of Blasius and Restus, for 4.5 gold coins, valid until my death, so that the said Elias can do with me as he pleases." So there you have, that must have been the model. They realized they could get away with Unum Sanctum.
So Unum Sanctum Catholicum means what exactly?
It means defending the goodness, truth, and beauty of Catholicism, because it says Unum Sanctum Catholicam, defending the goodness, truth, and beauty of Catholicism.
And extraordinary how many people buy into this trite bullshit even today. Quite extraordinary how anyone can defend any aspect or element of Catholicism is just beyond me. It's just beyond my mind. I cannot understand it. Can you understand any part of it?
I have been trying to lately, Sacha, and what I've realized is that the true bloodline of the true Christians has followed through to today, and they still exist, but in a parallel universe or a different timeline than these Roman Catholic SOBs. Right. And I almost forgot to mention the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books. That was the first censorship. and well, official anyway. And today, what do we have? You know, we have Google. So you see the parallels, they just go on and on and on. And Pope Innocent III in 1300, this is what he said: the Pope is at the center of the world, below God, but above men. And nothing has changed since. And you can just see how the Renaissance was a stepping stone toward globalism, using famine, death, and wars. You know, it's just so obvious now. And then slavery was a huge thing too.
Very good. So some popes in the 1400s arguing for the enslavement of non-Christians as an instrument for conversion. Well, I'm sure it worked. A treat.
Because before 1400, slavery had existed in Europe from classical times and continued throughout the Renaissance. And there were African humans being kidnapped and brought to Italy, Spain, southern France, Portugal, well before the discovery of the New World in 1492.
Yeah.
I found that often these slaves are referred to as other commodities. And we know what that means: human trafficking.
Yeah. Yes. Which is still
Slavery.
one of the biggest industries on earth.
And the big thing to me, as far as the Renaissance goes, we can't forget that a slave has no time for creativity or art. And the Renaissance was supposed to be all about elevating human creativity through art. And this just shows it absolutely was not. And just as today we have unprotected borders all over the world today, serving the purpose of damaging our true evolution. And what I realized today was the globalists have figured out a way to make the slaves come to them, because it's really easy to indoctrinate the masses of immigrants that are unfamiliar with the language and tradition of the country they arrive in. Hence the reset we're going through right now, because they want to fulfill the agenda of the resetters. So the plan is obviously to kill off the original inhabitants and replace them with the malleable slave migrant, using disease to aid their plans. And now here we are, all digitally trafficked in this day and age. And that is exactly what is going on today. But they just figured out they don't have to go and take boats and pick people up. They can just bring them over. They can just make them come over here by themselves. And here we are at the beginning of examples of why I believe that art produced by the great artists of the Renaissance did not create the works they were given credit for. And Raphael is a stunning example of that. It puts him in some kind of God category, because he died at the age of 37, yet he's said to have produced a huge body of work that included sculptures, buildings, frescoes, engravings, and paintings. But if he started working, say, when he was like 16 years old, that would give him like 21 years of life to produce all these great accomplishments. But never mind that, he was also orphaned at the age of 11 and is said to have led a nomadic life. So at what point do you stop and weigh the odds, you know, of him creating so much?
Oh, darling, you don't question any of the official narrative that comes out of Oxbridge, for God's sake. Have you learned nothing?
I think I have not. You know, he was like chief architect of the Pope. But the funniest thing of all, I think it's in this slide, I'm not sure. I'll keep it for the next one. So this is the list of all his works. I don't expect you to read them. It's just to show how much, you know, he all the murals and I'm sure they had assistants, and I'm sure that he didn't paint everything by himself. And I really feel that like they were restoring the old pieces left behind by the Tartarians.
Yeah.
Because he worked on St. Peter's. Well, no, he didn't work on St. Peter's. It took 150 years to build St. Peter's, but Raphael built a palace in 4 years. So there's no way to determine that he accomplished all that he is said to have accomplished. And his level of prolific matches exactly the architect said to have built scores of these huge architectural wonders all around the world. We have one down the road here. We have the Stone Arch Bridge, which was said to be built in 3 years. In the winter months would cut that time in half. But here's the kicker, Sacha. On top of being so busy, Raphael had a reputation for being a sex maniac and was believed to have died of syphilis in 1520 at the age of 37. But here's the kicker of the kicker. 400 years after his death, medical researchers have finally put that tall tale to rest. And a new study suggests that the real cause of his death was a disease similar to the coronavirus.
Well, there you go. There you go.
Oh, and here's Jacopo Galli's garden in Rome, and it's literally littered with ancient sculptures.
Great. Love it.
So many. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's a delightful smoking gun in an etching.
Yeah, it sure is. Cream of the crop of my findings. So they claimed that they made them, but I'm sure they found a lot of them.
Yeah.
And they were probably usurping the art from the 1,000 years of peace that preceded them. And this is why they run around purging information and destroying beautiful structures all over the world to hide this stuff. But it always seems to come to the surface. And those Medici, boy, they were quick to go sniffing among the spoils and turn their finds into a lucrative international business model. And those Medicis, for almost 300 consecutive years, they snapped up the art, lied about it, and inflicted untold irreversible damage to humanity's creative evolution in doing so. And here's an example of the first forgery that Michelangelo ever made. And he went and ripped off Cardinal Raphael Riaro, but the cardinal rewarded him for his forgery, and he was invited to Rome, and that's where he became so famous, because of his forgery, and probably to make more forgeries. So these forgeries can't help but arouse suspicion about the authenticity of his other great works. But then at the time, everyone was admiring all these forgeries, and they were selling them, making loads of money. Another thing that Raphael was interested by the way, was the preservation of antiquities, amongst all the other things he did. And he had
27-year-old sex maniac. Well, he kept busy. He kept very busy.
He was very busy. And then another thing these artists did is they lifted the faces and poses of these sculptures and these antique art pieces, and they literally dropped them into their artwork. So, there's certain poses that you can take and drop it in. And so it had a lot to do with just copying the ancient. Well, it was, see, even in my head, I'm so brainwashed that I keep calling them ancient when they weren't ancient. And here we have an example of something that was thought to have been the work of Michelangelo. It was the death of Count Ugolino and his sons. So, they make these mistakes, and then they have to go back and keep rectifying them, because it was really easy to confuse, because they were so generic.
Okay.
And then I'm even doubting if Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel.
Okay, that's a great statement. I love that. That's a headline.
And here's a photograph of the Roman ruins. So what is that? That's 200 years ago. Is it an archaeological dig or a mud flood? And there's loads of stuff lying around there too still. So, you know, which is the bigger crime? Pretending the statues were authentic and ancient artifacts from eons ago, or Michelangelo and others usurping these ancient sculptures as their own. And I think both were probably occurring.
So you suggest with Raphael that there's no possibility that he could have accomplished all that he has purported to have accomplished in his 37 years. So number one, that's your takeaway there. And you say the same for Michelangelo.
I'm not as hard on Michelangelo as I am on Raphael. So they were forging everything. It was almost like the crypto of the day. You know, they were shipping it out all over Europe and making a fortune, and they're working together with the popes and everybody, making so much money on all of this, because the collectors of the Renaissance art some wanted it to look great, others wanted to look old and ruined, you know, so they do a little restyling, maybe they change their hair, or they were really fiddling with the old stuff, you know. Okay, so here we are at St. Peters Basilica in Rome. Oh, this is where Michelangelo crumbles down to the ground, because it was said that he undertook to solve problems raising a dome as large as the Pantheon, but twice as high. And that's when he was said to have spent his final years designing St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Yep, he's 88 years old. And the building had been in progress for 40 years and was said to have looked like ancient ruins. What does that tell you? So the Catholic Church calls on well, they didn't have phones then, but calls on Michelangelo and like begs him to finish the basilica. But he had just finished the tomb of Julius II, you know, which was said to have taken him 40 years to do, in between sculpting and painting, completing the Sistine Chapel, writing 2 biographies, you know, and he was preparing to retire, but no, he turns around and takes on this huge project, the highest dome in the world, 448 feet and 1 inch high. So, you know, there's so many discrepancies there. And remember, he claimed that he wasn't an architect. So I can just see all these people sitting around in Rome saying, how can we give Michelangelo the credit for creating this dome? And then there's, let's call it lending sculptural integrity, you know, and they just go on and on with their blah, 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 and we all just buy it. And we believe that just one man is able to design and oversee the building of St. Peter's Dome and fill the church with incredible larger-than-life sculptures and get up in the roof and in the greatest dome in the world and paint it. You know, I don't think so.
Well, you've got to, you know, sympathize with the academics who have, you know, supported and endorsed and espoused these deceptions over history. I mean, the poor things, you know, are born with silken hands in the portals of academia, a very kind of self-serving feedback loop of hubris, and spreading their goose liver pate on crumpets in their heavily funded university digs. I mean, you know, what the fuck? Yeah, it's just so much hubris, so much psycho-intellectual mania and hubris has gone into writing the fucking books. That's the problem. Just tawdry fellows, all too many of them. Not all, it has to be said, some extraordinary minds and hearts, obviously, in academia, but arguably the lion's share of them just, again, a feedback loop of tawdry fellows and their innate hubris.
And not to mention, we haven't even mentioned this yet, Sacha, the giants and the size of the buildings.
Yeah,
you know?
Right. Okay, let's move on.
So here we are at the Palace of Versailles, and Michelangelo again is attributed to painting the dome there. But the problem with that is I was looking really closely at it and scrutinizing it, and it just didn't look right. And that is because Michelangelo died in 1564, and that was 3 decades before the Baroque period was said to have begun. And you can see, any eye can see, this is clearly Baroque or Rococo.
Yes, absolutely.
But now they're attributing stuff to him in faraway lands.
This is really interesting, of course, and this is really compelling forensics. Jane, you know what we should do is we should put these questions now to the curators of some of these publicly funded institutions. The Lazarus Initiative should put some of these seminal questions, forensic question marks, and we should formally call out and challenge some of the curators and stewards of these publicly funded institutions, whether you're talking the Vatican or whatever, and put it as an open challenge. What do you think?
Absolutely, because we've got visual proof. It's not like scientific proof where you have to go into a laboratory. This is visual proof. You can just see it. Anyone can see it.
Yeah, right. So Camera degli Sposi, Palazzo Ducale, Mantua. What are we looking at?
We're looking at the work of Andrea Mantegna. And he also did the Death of Christ. And now I'm looking at the frescoes, and I'm not seeing that it's the same artist here. But it was like an all-in-the-family art business, because Andrea, who was an artist active in the late 13th century, 1431 on, he just happened to be Jacopo Galli's son-in-law, the guy with all the sculptures lying around in the garden.
Yeah.
But he also happened to be a student of Roman archaeology. And he traveled in Italy and maybe Greece, and he collected antique statues and reliefs and vases and made drawings from them and made his collection available for others to study. Now, this just does not sound like an artist to me. You just don't do those things. And another thing he had was a printing business, one of the first printing business in Venice around 1500, when the copper plate printing technology came out. So, I'm just not believing it. And here I'm questioning really deeply now, where are the women painters? Did we ever hear of any women painters before the Renaissance? There are a few during the Renaissance, but these images of these loving, nurturing mothers, they don't carry the resonance or the signature of the satanic Roman Catholic Church. They carry more the energy of a woman painter, the softness and the gentleness. Just, it reminds me of more of like Berthe Morisot's work, when she conveys the loving connection between the mother and child.
Yes.
And in this one too, both the women at the bottom are attributed to the same artist, but they don't look like they're even in the same league. That's Jan van Eyck. So it's just more and more discrepancies, where in many cases, and this is another thing, you never see an artist evolve. You never see, early work, old when they were old. It's always just a perfect thing that they've spit out.
Yeah.
I've never seen the evolution of any of these artists.
Okay.
And so I'm beginning to think that these domes and everything were the work of thousands of artists over many, many years, because there's just too many. There's 900 churches in Rome, and if you add all the private chapels, you get to 1,600 just in Rome. And they're all filled with all of this stuff, And then there's the scope and the detail, and it's just incredible. And here I put this image here because it shows a peeling away dome. And I'm thinking this is probably how the inheritors found the state of the domes that they inherited, and they repaired them. But also, I think the Tartarians had a much more highly evolved way of doing fresco, and theirs lasted longer because the new frescoes peel off and flake away because they didn't have the tech. They didn't have secret ingredients. Okay, now here we have an example of a painting of a building that was done in 1360. But this basilica was said to have taken 170 years of work and the combined efforts of many generations of architects and artists to create. So that doesn't add up, because that's 170 years, and it was changed over time. And it was consecrated as a church in 393 by St. Ambrose of Milan, and it was finished in the 1400s. So that took 1,000 years to complete. There's your 1,000 years. And then, as I said before, all these churches, all these domes, it constitutes so much church decorating, never mind the sculptures to create the inside and on the roofs and everywhere. It's almost like they were decorating cakes, at the rate that they were churning them out.
Yeah.
And then what is never considered is all the ornate decorative carvings and the masonry accompanying the art. Like, who did all that? We don't get the artists who did all the creative decorative edges around everything that we see. And then here again, what about the great height of the arches and the doorways? It's so obviously out of proportion to the size of the men at the time. And then now we're going to go to the exterior sculptures. And this makes me ask why the sculptures of the Renaissance are said to be so remarkable when they hardly differ in anatomical perfection from this whole litter of sculptures that are scattered throughout the world. Here's another one. We have some in Minnesota, there's some in Russia, and all of these perfect stone, sometimes gold-plated, they're all over the world.
All over.
They seem mass-produced just to adorn exteriors of buildings. There really were a dime a dozen, just churned out with no name as to who created them.
One wonders if there was a kind of almost etheric 3D printing technology or something where the artist could be wired up to something, and whatever they imagined would be immediately cast in perfect marble or granite or metal. It almost feels as though it's the imagined realm that is instantaneously printed, right? Because it's still a magnificent accomplishment of the imagination in any event. So many of these frescoes and reliefs, which are just staggeringly complex and symbolic and very, very beautiful and powerful imagery. It's not as though they're throwaway. So I don't take away from the fact that the imagined realm is everything, but it just, as you are painting this picture for us, it's increasingly implausible to consider that it's anything other than a kind of magic wand technology. And of course, nowadays, we're almost there. We're getting there with artificial intelligence in these new synthetic software programs where you can just type in a bunch of words and up comes an AI rendered, staggeringly beautiful artwork. I've been studying this stuff in recent weeks with architecture and with artists, and looking at staggeringly powerful imagery and recognizing that they were created in seconds, inputting a little bit of data and then allowing the AI program to do the rendering. And it's almost as though we're getting to that point now, almost, where we could also imagine staggeringly powerful images and statuary and then have them printed instantaneously.
Your perception is so outstanding, because I left this slide out because I wanted to break this down smaller. But there does exist a sculpture called The Young Girl. I think it was Corradini maybe who did it. Corradini, there are a lot of them similar names. But she has this little curl in the middle of her forehead, and there's two of these sculptures. And in the one sculpture, the curl has moved. The other one, it's in a different position, and the stitching on her clothes is visible, as if it was just snapped 3D rendition, take another one, and then produced.
Amazing.
I left that. So we'll move on. We all know this now, that Tartaria is everywhere. We've had the researchers out there for 10 years. We've got elephants, lions, and Greeks. Oh my. We've got griffins and Greek sculpture in Asia, so it's everywhere. And this is very interesting. So watch closely at the slide and you'll see the renovation of it slowly come into fruition there. So this is how bad the branding is, Sacha. This portrait of Leonardo, you just look at it and you go, Leonardo, it's branded. It's not even him.
Yeah.
He died much, much younger than that. It's probably his father or an uncle. But he's on the cover of all the books about Michelangelo, and we immediately think it's him, but it's Renaissance image branding. And then on the right, we have a painting by Salvator Mundi, painted by Bernardino Luini. And the thing about this painting was it sold for $450 million to Saudi prince. But then they discovered that Leonardo da Vinci hadn't painted it.
Oh, geez.
But then they said, oh, wait, he painted maybe 5 to 20% of it. So it's okay. It's Leonardo's painting.
Wow.
So there you go. It's all about money, right?
Well, no, that art world is all about laundering money.
Oh yeah, and also making money. And here's another funny thing about Leonardo. Oh, he's trying to look so clever. Remember you mentioned Ptolemy? And Ptolemy is famous for his world map. And then in his little index, Leicester, he takes Ptolemy's world map and makes it into this really great illustration with people blowing the wind across the world. And then they also said that he painted the ceiling of Sala de As, and it's like nothing. But the biggest thing that I found out that Leonardo ever said was, the Medici made me and the Medici destroyed me.
Right.
And the thing about the Medicis is that the thing about Leonardo is that he died at 67 years old, yet he's got about 10 paintings in the world, and most of them are unfinished. Adoration of the Magi, or so many are unfinished. So he really wasn't the artist that we think of him as. And guess what? Did you know this? So the greatest painting in the whole wide world, there's two of them. And this one on it's called the Isleworth Mona Lisa. And the story goes that Leonardo carried his first little Mona Lisa around with him, working on it for 10 years. So it just doesn't make sense that the second painting, which is the one he carried around with him, took 10 years to paint. And if he churned out this exact proportional replica, it just doesn't make sense. And there's 3 Virgin of the Rocks. They say there's 2, but then I found another one all by myself.
Wow.
So did his assistant paint one? Who painted the 3rd one? You know, there's just no way of knowing. So I'm just going to guess that Leonardo's assistant painted the one on the right, because I recognize the baby in the one on the left, which is in another painting of the Madonna and Child. So there you go, 3 versions of that one. And now we're at Hieronymus Bosch, and this is who the Roman Catholic Church really cashed in on him big time. They had their printing presses. They were sending this out all over Austria, all over Europe, because they were getting their money, their financial instruments for purgatory. So they were putting these images of sin and hell and everything else out there en masse in order to have the ignorant masses come running to them to pay their tithes for their sins. And his work was just so highly prostituted. And he's said to have represented the early Netherlandish painting school, but he was really, truly a representative of the Catholic Church and its huge ad campaign to promote hell and sin and get rich off purgatory.
Interesting.
And then here I'm bringing you back to today with this image, because you can see it's the same old tricks in a different era. And Bosch's gruesome and unearthly depictions of hell have been brought forward into this present time. And the church leaders have made themselves the gatekeepers of heaven, and they're paid handsomely for bestowing upon themselves the power to forgive sin.
Yes.
And claim to have the knowledge of death and the afterlife and the unknown. But meanwhile, they're refining the art of spelling and black magic and using it for sacrifices to their true God.
And fucking up kiddies by best accounts.
So here we are.
Long tradition of pedophilia is anything to go by.
Well, I'm getting to that. Boy, that's a blast and a half. So here we are at the printing press. I really don't need to say much about it. You know, they just up their ability to produce images, and also anyone who couldn't read could now visually read. And then they got educated in the arts. But then the next thing we have to ask is, you know, where all those giant books come from with the medieval imagery on the pages. And this is where I go back to the David being 17 feet high.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, did Michelangelo sculpt that? And I read recently, you know, like the stone archways, like the Arc de Triomphe, but smaller. Someone said that those could have possibly have been some of the printing presses, but they may have been too big. So now we're at the presence of UFOs during the Renaissance, and
very good. And ancient astronauts.
What the most incredible thing about this is, we know they're out there, and there's some that are benevolent and they look out for us. And it's really weird that in these paintings, they're all either at the birth or the death of Christ. So they're watching just like they do today. So I found that just amazing.
The watches.
And here we are with it's called the Deposition from the Cross by Rosso Fiorentino in 1528. We have a very clear view of a really malevolent looking little demon, and he is also present at the death of Christ. And this is a painting. It's a dome, and I just chose this one piece out of it. It was painted by 2 artists, you know, because they're interchangeable, Federico Zuccari and Giorgio Vasari. And another thing about this basilica was that it was said to have been begun by Pope Julius II in 1506 and completed in 1615. But that again, that's a very, very short, that's a really, really long time for a building. But here we have these two artists working on the same mural, which shows that it hasn't got anything to do with the congruency of the style of an individual talented artist, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to merge them.
Indeed.
And here are the Vanquishing of Lucifer paintings, which I feel predated the Renaissance and were a warning to us. It just rings so many bells for me that they're all said to be painted during the Renaissance, and they depict Satan and Lucifer being vanquished. But I'm sure the church wouldn't have commissioned or tolerated these paintings depicting the death of their own God. You know, the Vanquishing of Lucifer paintings, there's so many, I'm sure that they predated the Renaissance and were more likely created during the 1,000-year period of the age of Grand Tartary. And then I thought this was a dead giveaway with Francisco Goya. He was much later, at the end of the Renaissance, maybe even into the Rococo. But he died miserable, diseased, alone, and he had been commissioned in his heyday by the Spanish churches, and so he knew what they were up to. And I feel like this is almost, these paintings are like his deathbed confession, because they were literally scraped off the walls of his home where he died and reconstituted.
Is that right?
And he had hoped for political and religious reform, but he didn't get it. He was a liberal, and he became delusioned when the restored Bourbon monarchy and Catholic hierarchy rejected the Spanish Constitution of 1812. So then he went downhill all the way after that and exposed them. But it took 50 years after he died for somebody to come along and rescue them. And thank God we have them, because they just show us exactly what was going on.
Fascinating.
Here's your friend.
Yes.
This is what I heard him say. Nero was the Antichrist of the time, and him being right out of Italy, right there, so close to everything, I just had to believe him. So
yeah, let's invite Leo into Lazarus, into a symposium panel for the next Lazarus, so we can pick up on this.
This is why I'm saying that the Renaissance was the rebirth of Lucifer, because the fall of Rome didn't happen when it fell, and then it fell much later, and there's the Antichrist right there in the midst of it all.
But define for me the fall of Rome. If Rome has been running supreme, governing supreme, the hegemony over the planetary mind and heart for the last 2,000 years in any event. So when you talk about the fall of Rome, what are you referring? I mean, arguably the fall of Rome is taking place right now.
Well, in America, it certainly is. Yeah, I'd say so. Absolutely. But the fall of Rome, they say it was 475 AD or somewhere around there. But I honestly believe it was the actual fall, one of the sacks of Rome, when Rome was sacked and all the wealthy elites were run out of town by the peasants. I'm sure that was really it. But, you know, like I said, it's so difficult, Sacha, because your head is full of all the old stuff, and you've got to measure and keep moving the markers, and it gets very difficult.
Well, I mean, when was Council of Nicaea?
I don't know when the Council of Nicaea was.
I'll tell you now. I mean, I've been lecturing on it for a long time. But the exact date was 325 AD. So that was technically the fall of Rome was happening at that time as it reconstituted the evil of the Caesars of Rome, and all of the blood cult formatted itself into the Roman Catholic Church. off the back of the Council of Nicaea, and then franchised its way onto the world. So yeah, Rome never fell. Rome changed shape and changed its face and shape-shifted, basically.
Well, they just needed a clear historical marker to make it look like they were starting all fresh and new and enlightened.
Yeah.
So
So
one thing about back in the day, you know, people were named after their occupation or their town. And I found it very interesting that the Medici, I looked at the Latin etymology and I came up with medic. And here is where Leonardo played a big part in this, because he was dissecting and drawing the inside of human bodies, and they presented it in the name of art, but really it was in the name of science for the Medicis. And
Da Vinci was certainly doing a great deal of that as well.
Yeah, it was Da Vinci. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or did I say the Medici?
No, you said Michelangelo was doing.
Oh, yeah, I got that wrong. Thanks for correcting me. And so I'm thinking, you know, with the Medici, not only the mentors of the Rothschilds for banking, but they were also the mentors for Big Pharma back in the day too.
Yeah.
And here they are. You know, was the Renaissance actually the rebirth of the beginning of pharmakia? There's a very good possibility of it, because it's all in the name of art, remember? And look at that sketch of the baby in the uterus. Is it from a pregnant woman that died? Or is it a very late term abortion? We don't know.
I like this. The rebirth, I'm taking a note. The rebirth of the beginning of pharmacopoeia, did you say?
Pharmakia and the banking system. And then guess who bought Da Vinci's Codex Leicester, Sacha?
Yeah.
None other than Bill Gates. And he paid over $30 million for it, because he wanted that energy signature. This is a connection, you know?
Okay, I like this. I'm taking notes here, girl.
So today's medics have continued the probing to the point where they are now dissecting the human genome and much more. But he was a forerunner in that. That's where they started it all, probing and digging and diving into the human body, because that's why they killed Jesus Christ, because they saw him lay their hands on people and heal them. And that's the last thing they wanted us to be able to do or learn. They wanted to start digging and cutting and everything else. So it was in 1506 that he started dissecting these bodies. And an interesting story I read was that he sat and watched a peaceful man die, a peaceful death, that he just watched, and then he picked them up, went off with them, and chopped them all up. So I think that's one of the Rome's biggest reasons for killing Christ. I mean, you can call me crazy if you want, but I don't know. When you start putting two and two together, you see a lot. And this is why I'm thinking that this was the roots of transhumanism too, because he was doing robotics and working out the human figure and its movements. And then his robotics became part of his weapons of war series.
Okay, this is very good.
And then here's his body slicer that can chop up people in a war situation. And this is the thought process of a genocidal eugenicist mindset. And he's working on behalf of Satanists, and he's no longer interested in art anyway. He never painted again. And he almost begged the Sforzas to take him in, to finance him to create weapons of war. I read the letter that he wrote them. And yet he's supposed to be this great polymath genius, Madonna painter, you know, and you'd think he would be inventing things for the betterment of humanity and not its demise. And here's my little cherry on the top from going up into the late 1600s, 1700s. This graphic is really a great metaphor for the Renaissance hidden agenda, because it's along the same vein pardon the pun. We have more probing and experiments into the human body in the 1700s with Dr. Giuseppe Salerno's experiment commissioned by this flamboyant Prince Raimondo di Sangro. And he was said to have been the Da Vinci of his time. He was initiated into the ancient alchemical rituals, sacred art or king's art, they called it, which had been handed down through the centuries from Egyptian priests, through their disciples. And he was the one that introduced Freemasonry to Naples and became the head of the Neapolitan Masonic Lodge there. And then there's this weird technology that he used to create the veiled effect over the Christ. So you can see that, the way that veil falls, and that's made of marble, and it looks for all the world like cloth.
Yeah.
So people have decided that he's using this ancient alchemical knowledge to create this. And then meanwhile, in the underground chamber of his San Severo chapel, you have this machine anatomiche, which are these anatomical models which have reproduced the entire circulatory system of a woman and a man, their whole arteriovenous system, and it's almost perfectly intact. And this Giuseppe guy made it in about 1763. And there's this legend going around that this Di Sangro guy, together with the doctor, used two servants for these alchemical experiments, and the woman at the time was pregnant, so there used to be a little baby at her feet, but somebody ran off with that in 1990. And so there's all these legends, but whatever's going on, I mean, he's also said to have killed people so that he could use their bones and skin for experiments. But you can see it goes deeper and deeper and deeper into the occult as they move on. And then here's the famous, I looked for current signs of the banking magnates. And so it looks like the Rothschilds were definitely taking on the whole Medici. And there were the Fuggers. If you ever wondered where the name "you dirty Fugger" comes from, it must come from Italy. And then there were the Royal Habsburgs too. And all family dynasties still have operational banks today, but I'm really doubting for very much longer because nothing much has changed.
Yeah.
And, so that's exactly what the Renaissance period accomplished. What it set out to establish, as you mentioned in the very, very, very beginning of this presentation.
Very good.
And then here come the robber barons, the wretches of riches, and we know all about them. One thing that came out of the Renaissance period, Sacha, is inventiveness. So that, they saw all these inventions, the creativity had been stimulated, but they soon quashed it. They threw out Tesla's stuff from Tartaria and all that, and they brought in Hollywood, Disneyland, Soho, coming right around the corner for the whole entertainment distraction. And they quickly sought to prevent any further surges of human inventiveness by establishing those think tanks to curtail our creativity, and by establishing a hierarchical, exclusive education system, which I call academia, i.e. the great forgetting.
Very good.
And now I'm looking at, we're very close to coming to the close of this now. So I'm just going to show you here that the European economy in 1500, Italy was at the top, and it was almost double anyone else in the whole of Europe. And in 1500, it was obviously at the top. And then as we move forward in time, we see that Britain gets the crown, goes to the top, and we can see China at the very bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States isn't on the map yet because they didn't have statistics. But then as you see, we jumped to 2020, we've got China at the top. The whole Marxist, fascist, communist, socialist agenda is now winning. And it just shows us it only took 70 years for that to happen. So it just shows you so clearly how they can manipulate the whole world economy in 2 seconds, time. And then obviously this death and devastation has continued, and I'm sure it was a lot the same back then, just slaying people. And now what they've cleverly done is they're mining essential products for people in the industrial countries to just survive, because they have to have these things in order to play in the marketplace. If you didn't have a phone, you probably couldn't make a living.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go through this really quickly now because I feel like it's gone on a bit long. Do you agree?
We're almost out of time for sure. In fact, we're over time.
Okay, well, maybe I'll skip this part. It's all about the pedophilia.
Run through the slides.
Okay, well, the pedophilia and the pederasty that was going on, and the sexual deviations were very much a part of the lifestyle of the royalty. You had Ambellus and Dionysus was the god of wine, and I'm connecting the wine to the grapes and the fruit and all of that, which is connected to adrenochrome. And this brings us right up to the present day where we have the pedophilia now. And then same thing here, and the satyr and the goat-like worship and all of that. And this little Ambellos is really a mini little baby goat that they're fornicating. And then I'm saying here that the Great Renaissance did nothing at all to elevate neither art or humanity, because this is the point we've reached with Marina Abramovic and her disgusting art. And then I'm saying that we've been living on a malevolent false timeline comprising of indoctrination, dehumanization, and pseudo-religion. And the periods of this Saturnalian timeline are ab initio, from Babylon to the Dark Ages, medieval Dark Ages to the fall of Rome, and opus evil would be their closing scenario. Opus evil, which was the Renaissance to the present. And then I'm saying if they can jolly well create a damn timeline, then so can I. And I'm going to create the timeless creation timeline, which comprises of educreation, compassion, and transcendence, the initiation of Christ consciousness through organic evolution being earth consciousness, actualization being consciousness of the self, and then ascension, which is cosmic consciousness. So let us depart the Renaissance model and the monster it has become today in the dust of history forever.
Very good. Very good. Okay, unshare your screen kindly. Good. Thank you. Fascinating. Very, very interesting indeed. The takeaway there for me is that the Renaissance is emerging as being the counterpoint to what we've been led to believe it was. So we're led to believe that the Renaissance was the point of emancipation, enlightenment, and so on. It appears that it may well have been the polar opposite. It was the great subversion, Psyop, which was a takedown of the enlightened and the Enlightenment, a breaking of the trajectory of history that connects us to the true Enlightenment, which would have been more connected to ancient Tartaria and so on. In which case, it's a very, very clever Babylonian Romanesque intrusion and interposition. Very, very clever indeed, and does explain a great deal, I must say, a great deal. So congratulations, you.
Thank you. Yes, it was a tragedy, to say the least, because we've lost all that evolution.
Right. But I love this, Jane, because it's a seminal piece in the correcting of history. I attribute this to you because I've never seen this even intimated anywhere else. But perhaps more stuff will come forward for sure. I'm wanting to put you and this narrative into a symposium format with historians and leading pundits, like we've discussed. Leo Zagami, maybe Santos Bonacci would be a good one as well. And for sure, I have one or two heavyweight theologian historians, which I'd like to bring in to this. And let's drill even further into it. What I'd like to do, as I said earlier, is have Lazarus Symposium sign off on a white paper on this subject of the Renaissance being a historical subversion, and establish some essential questions based on forensics, which we can then formally dispatch to by registered mail to the curators and stewards of the Vatican Library, of various other publicly funded institutions. Again, they're all publicly funded in the main. I think that they all are, but certainly in the main, they're publicly funded. This is public purse stuff. We have a right to question what the fuck the British Museum have been doing and what measure of deception they may have.
Well, I know that they have all of Charlemagne's armor over there, and you can't understand what's written on it until you translate it into Muslim or Arabic.
Interesting. Well, there you go. So let's do that. Let's see if we can format some essential questions based on, with the Renaissance in our targets, and see if we can call out. But first, we would need to craft a white paper and then have that signed off on. So let's look to accomplish
so
that.
do you'd see a paper of questions then, referring to the white paper?
I see a white paper which describes this theory that's emerging about the Renaissance being a complete fraud, and then put some questions to these publicly funded curators and stewards of museums, art galleries, historical houses, institutions, and so on, and send them off and see if we can get some goodly, godly responses from some of these people. They may well be piqued sufficiently.
Well, I think it would shake them up, because even your average person who loves the Renaissance and thinks it was this thing of enlightenment, they get harmed by even reading anything about this, you know.
Well, I'm harmed by even the notion that the Renaissance was a complete fraud, because the Renaissance to me is, let's say psycho-intellectually, the Renaissance has been for me an important backdrop to my own notions of enlightenment and of aesthetic and so on. So for me, I was compelled when you told me that you think you've uncovered the truth of the Renaissance, because it immediately kills that sacred cow in my own psycho-intellectual armory. And I like to have my sacred cows killed in front of me.
I don't necessarily like to go around killing cows myself.
Well, good. Look, that's taken us to well over the appointed time that we have, but this is going to run in any event that for the duration, and I'm sure that the audience, which is going to be commenting and feeding back, I think that if the time works out on the day, you and I might even be able to jump on the back end of when this is inserted into the Lazarus broadcast, because this is going to the public. This is open source at the end of the private symposium. And then maybe you and I can make ourselves available for another half hour or 45 minutes of Q&A with people who are watching this right now.
That would be great. I'd love to do that, Sacha.
Thank you very much, darling.
Okay,
This is the first in a series, because we're going to be drilling a great deal further into this. So thank you, Jane.
Absolutely
much
a pleasure. Love you,
All right.
Sacha. Bye.
Love you. There you go.